So my name is Buck Woody. I'm from Microsoft, and you can tell that for two reasons. One is that I started the sentence with the word so. Secondly, you can tell I'm from Microsoft because at some point in the session I will say I'm super excited to be here, right? But I'm very old, so at my age I actually am super excited to be anywhere. So that's okay. I do use humor throughout the presentation. If I insult you, I apologize. I'll get around to everyone as I have time. I start with myself. I'm very old. I'm an IT guy. I'm going to the Halloween costume party this year as a disgruntled IT worker. So I'm going to disrobe a little bit here. Is that all right? Is that going to scandalize anybody? All right. This is a little warm. Da, da, da. My mood music, please. All right. We're going to be talking about hybrid solutions for cloud computing. There's a couple things that I want to get out of the way right away. I've been in technology for a very long time. And things come around and they go around. There's a lot of things that you're going to hear today that you would have heard 20 or 30 years ago. And that's not surprising. It's just sort of the mainframe done right, at least in my opinion. But let me tell you a little bit about what we're going to cover today, and then the audience that I'm expecting that you are. And let me do this. When I describe this, if it's just not your cup of tea, that's completely okay. It's not going to bother me. There are a ton of other sessions here that are awesome. So if this information isn't valuable to you, it's not going to bother me if you walk out. It's okay. Okay? The only thing I ask is fill out your evals. Be honest on those evals. Put on there what you need to see and so on. I'm thrilled with that. But if you're only in here for part of it, it gets better as it goes. No, it doesn't. Fill it out if you stay for the whole thing. Otherwise, don't waste your time with the information. Fair? Make sense? All right, let's talk a little bit about what we're going to cover today. Now, you've got the errata. You've got what I said we were going to talk about. So for roughly the next hour, we're going to be talking about hybrid solutions for cloud technology. A couple of buzzwords in there that I really don't like. The first one is hybrid, and the second one is cloud. So I'm trying to eradicate the word cloud from the Microsoft vocabulary. I'm having limited to zero success. So we're all going to agree that's a buzzword. Anybody disagree that the word cloud is pure marketing bullcrap? Anybody disagree with that? Okay, good. It's not cloud. It's distributed computing. Let's change that word in this room today to distributed computing because that's what it is. That then makes the word hybrid unnecessary. We don't have to say the word hybrid anymore because distributed computing, by its very nature, is hybrid, right? It's one thing here, one thing there, and so on. Second myth I want to dispel is that Microsoft expects you to take what you have today, code, databases, whatever, and throw it up into the cloud or distributed computing or Azure. I want you to get that out of your head. I do not recommend that you do that. We're going to be talking about some architectural patterns. So let me describe myself and my job a little bit here at Microsoft. I'm an Azure Senior Technical Specialist. So I work in the pre-sales area. These are companies that use our technologies along with everybody else's. And what they do is they decide, what is this thing? How can I use it? They're more worried about capability. That's all they're looking to do is to solve a problem. I hate to break it to the geeks in the room, but most companies could care less about IT. It's a big black box that steals their soul. They don't understand it. It's all magic to them. You can tell this is true because when you go back to your office, your boss will ask you to do a trivial task and will act like your dog acts when you come home. They're just amazed that you're able to do that, right, with this trivial task. They will then turn around and tell you to do something that's impossible, like even on Star Trek. And they will wonder why you can't accomplish B when you could accomplish A, and you can't, through any means, explain to them how that works. Everybody had that experience? You've been through that before? Okay. That proves to you they're not in the IT business, you are. So hopefully the reason you're in this session is to learn more about how you could do things when it's required. Okay? So I work with these big clients in a pre-sales capacity, and what that means is they'll call me and say, Buck, you've been an architect for a long time. Used to do that with some folks that work here. How would you lay out, here's our problem, how would you lay out a computing solution for this? And I would lay down some things on premise, and I would lay down some things on our cloud servers, some on Amazon, some on Google, whatever it takes to get the problem solved is what I lay out. Sales then takes over, and they sell them the stuff that makes all that work. Is everybody comfortable with that? So, I will be speaking to you like I speak to my clients. I'm actually not a paid speaker. I'm not in marketing. I do this because this is what I do for a living as far as the work. So I'm talking to the following folks. If you're somebody that develops software, like you write code, I'll show a little bit of code today, but that's not really interesting. The code I'm going to show is very boring, but I'm just going to show you a sample of what could be done. If you're a senior developer, if you're an architect, anybody have the title of architect in there? Okay, a few of you, good. You're perfect for this presentation. If you're a senior DBA, in that you're the person that often describes the strategy your company will take to do something, then you're a good fit for this audience. If you're a junior DBA looking to learn a little bit more about SQL Azure and how that would work, I probably won't go into enough depth here for you, okay? So again, that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about architecture level stuff. We're going to be talking about concepts and patterns. We're going to be talking about how you solve problems using cloud technologies. Is that cool with everybody? If not, you're not going to offend me if you go. My other style is I like things very interactive. If you go to sleep, I will come sit on your lap. That's my promise. So rather than go to sleep, think of some inane, stupid question and ask me that, because I'll vector off with you. Now, we're going to cover everything that's in my deck, and we're going to do it in an hour. But I'm still willing to take any questions about anything, including the kilt or anything else. By the way, most of you notice I'm wearing a kilt. You see that? I'm doing that because we, on Thursday, middle of the past session, we always have a Women in Technology lunch where we encourage females to get more involved in technology. And they invite men to go to that. And in solidarity, some of us started wearing kilts because they look like little skirts, right? And mine looks quite fetching. It really does. My wife made this little skirt for me, so it's awesome. So we wear these on that day to show solidarity with the women. That's why you see so many guys running around in kilts, plus any excuse to show off my legs. All right, here we go. Any questions before we get started? If you need to email me or whatever, I'm buck.woody@microsoft.com. If you want to find out more about me, it's just buckwoody.com. Be careful how you spell it, because you can end up in an interesting location on the web with my name. Let's get some terms out of the way. Number one, again, I'm using the word cloud because that's what everybody hangs this stuff off of. We're replacing it in here mentally with distributed computing. When you talk to your boss, tell him cloud, because you'll sound like you know what you're doing and you'll sound all trendy. But just in your mind, do a map for me and do distributed computing. Can everybody go like this? Okay. You can ask questions at any time. All right. There are different modalities, and I didn't make up these terms, and some people hate even using these terms, but I don't. So we're going to go through these modalities quickly. I mentioned them yesterday in my briefing, if you were at that. How many folks were at my thing yesterday? Okay, so some of this will be a little redundant. Others of it will be an expansion of what we talked about there. So if you take a virtual machine, I'm just going to call that a VM. We okay with that? Okay, I'm going to call this a VM. If you take a VM and you put it somewhere else, and you serve it back out, some people call that cloud. This is called infrastructure as a service. What you're abstracting out here is the hardware. You guys are no longer dealing with hardware. It's a virtual machine. I think we're comfortable with this. This goes back, by the way, to the VMS operating system on these mini mainframe and microframe and mini frame computers. So VMs are not new. The difference that makes it sort of cloud is the fact of provisioning it. And by the provisioning, what we really mean here is the ability to click a button and what you need shows up and balances itself out into the network automatically. That's what we mean by that. Some of you are probably already doing something like this. Maybe it's manual. Maybe you build the VM and then you serve the SQL Server back out. How many folks are in charge of doing stuff like that here? A couple folks? Okay, good. So some people call that the private cloud. And that's fine. I don't care. That works. The key there is not the VMs. That's uninteresting. We all know about hypervisors. We all know how to virtualize. That's not what's interesting. What's interesting is that provisioning part. And if you take it to its extreme, the management and monitoring of it. When those VMs get busy, don't take that in any other way but what I meant it. When those and make little VMs, when the VMs they busy out, what do? Somebody who said that they're in charge of virtualizing. Who was that? Somebody over here. You raised your hand. I'm going to point at you. Yes, sir. What do you do when they get busy? Okay, so the response was, I call the developers and tell them to stop that. Okay, that's a great strategy. That's the worst strategy I've ever heard. No, that's okay. Seriously, is you kind of tell them, hey, you're busying out the box. You got to optimize your code. Okay, it varies. Anybody else who was doing that as part of their company? Yes, sir. You do what? You increase the capacity on the VM. But there's only so far you can go on that, right? I mean, there's only so many processors you can throw at a VM. There's only so much memory that a VM will hold right now. I mean, they go pretty high, but there's only so much, right? So you scale up, right? You scale up as well, kind of thing. You allocate, move it to a faster server, something like that. This is the problem with infrastructure as a service, is the scale factor. Because we pretty much treat it like we're on-premise, and we can only scale up. If you add another VM to the mix, it's like adding another log file inside SQL Server. Does adding another log file in SQL Server improve performance? Karen?
It depends.
No. Nicely done. Thanks, Paul Randall Surrogate. The answer is no. It's going to fill up one and spill over to the other. And it can. There are some situations where that might be a performance gain, but it's pretty rare. So this is the same thing as just adding another VM. If you just add another VM to the mix, does it make the problem go away? Well, no, nothing's running on it. It's not doing anything. So that balance is hard to achieve. However, VMs are pretty awesome if you need to type setup.exe, or you need access to the registry, or you need to add more memory, or whatever. You have control over the box, right? So that's where its play is. The next one's really easy to understand. This is just a service running somewhere that you log into, use, and log out. I used to say log in and then get off, but that's a totally different kind of website. It is a service, though, if you think about it, and it's cloud-based. So we should use the porn industry as some sort of cloud model, I suppose. Wow, that didn't take long, did it? Okay, so software as a service, pretty straightforward. Office 365 from Microsoft, Salesforce from Salesforce, and so on. We're familiar with these things. Even ADP. Those of you using ADP to process your payroll, you log on, you do something, you log off. There's nothing to install, nothing to configure. You really just don't care. So here's the deal with this one. This one's really good for what we call best fit solutions. So we're into the architecture discussion, by the way. If you're taking notes, the IaaS, really good when you need full control. SaaS, really good when it's a best fit. Okay? The only problem I have with SaaS, I have a problem with scale on IaaS. And it can be done, by the way. You can still scale properly on IaaS, but it's a lot of work. Trust me, I've done it. It's a lot of work. With the SaaS part, the scary thing about SaaS is you're kind of locked in a lot of times from the data standpoint. Once you record your data, if you call ADP and say, could you ship me that database, please? They'll be like, you can export screens if you want. They won't like give you your data back so that you could go to a competitor. It's fine. It's completely okay. Just think about it, okay? You're the architects. You're the senior devs. You're the senior DBAs. They're looking to you to make these decisions. So in your architecture sort of mental breakdown of where you would use something, lots of control, best fit. Everybody with me? Questions on these? Cost is funny on IaaS because often you just pay for a virtual machine or you build it yourself in the cloud and you own everything, right? With SaaS, it's usually by the seat or by the use, that kind of thing, a lot of times. So the cost model is that way. And if you're in an architect role or a senior DBA role or a senior dev role, which is who should be in this audience, those are things you have to care about. How many of you don't have to care about cost? Nobody ever tells you. You don't have to care about cost at all? You're with Microsoft, sir, are you? Yeah, because our cost is zero, right? They say don't buy anything. Write it yourself. Hey, how's it going, man? Good to see you. Glad you could make it. But we all have to care about cost. I mean, seriously, most of you, and I'm not saying, oh, don't we all have to care about cost? It's not a marketing play. I'm saying, are you asked to architect solutions that are cheaper than another solution? How many of you have been approached and told, I need you to change what we're doing now to something that's less expensive as a project? Wow, everybody. Can you tell us about that, Colin, a little bit? Tell us what when you were asked to do that, what did they make you do? Oh, they do it a lot. This is a constant thing. So consolidation you mentioned. And what else? Anything else? Have they told you to move away from one app to one that's cheaper? Have they ever done that? You don't have to tell me the app. Yeah, they have done that. Okay. Interesting stuff. And other folks in that same barrel. Wow, that's a lot. I don't think I've ever had that many people tell me that they've been approached for a project to reduce costs as the driver. That's interesting. So in that case, you need to understand the costing model of each of these. I actually have something, go out and Bing, again, don't use that Google thing because that'll get you in all kind of trouble. There's all kind of bad things on that website. But go out and look up on your favorite search engine of choice, named Bing, make sure you look up something called, and if you're taking notes, cost-based architecture, CBA, cost-based architecture. It's the latest thing, and if you're an architect, they're going to expect you to know the latest three-letter acronym, or TLA. So it's a CBA, or cost-based architecture. It's basically laying out the cost of a system per unit, whether that's per customer or whatever, because now what they're wanting to know, your businesses, if they haven't done this to you already, they've done it to me, my clients have, they say, we need to know how much it costs per click with my customer. We're going to put up a website, they're going to buy stuff. We want to do an ROI. We want to do a delta, a profit margin. To do a profit margin, you have to have your cost, correct? To get cost, and what do we say? Well, you buy a server and you install SQL and you license that, and then you got to hire Karen to come in and run it, and she's really expensive and kind of high maintenance, and so she comes in periodically when she feels like it, and she's in Canada, so we never know what she's saying. Anyway, they'll ask you, how much does that cost per click? That's kind of tough to figure out, isn't it? Have you ever figured out an on-premises cost per click? Don't even suggest it to your boss. We'll keep that right in here in this room because I'll make you do it, and it's really hard. All right. Figure these two out. Best fit, most control. Let's talk about Azure. And when I say Azure, I'm talking about Windows Azure and SQL Azure in this session. We're going to cover both. If you're not a dev, stay with me. It's okay. All right? But basically, Azure is what's called a platform as a service. What does that do? I'm going to move this mouse up here. Is that going to work? Yeah, it works. So on the platform as a service, we start out with the developer or the architect. That's where we start. If you're an infrastructure person, if you care about SANs and hardware and LANs, that's not where we start with a PaaS. You probably start over in the IaaS area. Everybody with me? And you're definitely not in the SaaS area. And the developer's not in the SaaS area. Matter of fact, nobody in this room is in the SaaS area. Who takes care of SaaS? You do. Describe that for me a little better. Okay. So her response was she works for a SaaS client. What I'm saying is nobody in here makes the decision at a company to go to SaaS. How many of you have how many of you are in charge of the decision of whether the company uses ADP or not? Most of us are not, right? What happens? The business person has a credit card? You're not involved. Yes, sir.
That's not true because when they have to select a SaaS company,
Yep.
evaluate how they
Very good. Thank you. Thank you. You know what a good question is? Does everybody know what a good question is? That's a question the presenter can answer. Do you know what a great question is? That's a question I answer on a slide that's coming up. Thank you. We'll come to that. All right, that's a little tip if you're a presenter. We start out with Visual Studio or Eclipse. That's where Azure starts. You can use Visual Studio Express. That's fine. Pull it down. You pull down a software development kit. It will give you a free little piece of Azure running right on your desktop. No talking to Microsoft. You don't have to be connected to the internet. You're not paying for anything. Everybody with me? You've got a little simulated Azure environment all right there on your little laptop or a VM, which is what I use on my laptop. Okay? So I write code, I run it, I can hit it, I can do all kind of stuff to it right there, never touch Microsoft. Everybody with me? All right, that's where we start. But at some point, I'm done. I check that stuff into SourceSafe and all the rest. And I click a button. Normally what I do when I'm writing software, Java, and by the way, we support Eclipse as well, Java or .NET languages, so on. We right-click and we do what? We publish, right, out to a server, a web server or a fat server, right? One of the two. This time you don't. You right-click and you deploy it to Azure. You can think of Azure. I'm going to get in a lot of trouble from the Microsoft side for saying it, but it's okay. They haven't fired me yet. Okay? Here's the way this works. You can think of Azure as a big, gigantic computer running somewhere. Right? You really can. And we're going to tear that apart a lot in just a minute. So you pop a button and you publish to Azure. You get a nasty URL back from Azure. You do a CNAME or an A name. Everybody know what a CNAME? Anybody not know what a CNAME or an A name is? All right. So a CNAME or an A name is how you have buckwoody.com. That's really www.powweb.com/buckwoody. It's a way of redirecting a URL to a different URL. So you'll have mycompany.com, which will in fact point to an ugly DNS name underneath that belongs to me, to Microsoft. Everybody with me? That's now running. You're not paying for it. As more people use it, what happens is, this is kind of interesting. Stick with me here. We are kind of like an infrastructure, IaaS, but we're not IaaS. We're kind of like an infrastructure where you become a SaaS. That's what you're doing today. It's exactly what you're doing. You're a SaaS to your customers. When they use you, they're software as a service. But not to you. You're building the service. So that's what Azure is for. It's actually exactly for that kind of company. Traditionally, these companies have been in either an IaaS world or they own their own servers, right? One of the two. This is a way of not having to own them anymore. That's all it is. And it's not just that we abstract out the hardware. We abstract out the operating system, too. There's an operating system. It happens to be Windows or a kind of Windows. But you don't care. How many people got a little nervous when I said the word, you don't care? Where are my type A folks? Everybody raise your hand. You're all type A or you wouldn't be in here. All right. This is like a big Asperger's ward. All right. So the idea is that we don't like the words, we don't care. Of course I care. You care. You do care that it gets done. But how many of you just can't wait for Patch Tuesday on your operating systems and just looking forward to that pager going off, right? Nobody. So we do that. We take care of the OS. There is an OS. It's running, but we do that. And you're like, wow, I don't know if I trust you or not. Great. That's a good thing. It's a good mental place to be. So you become a SaaS basically on our infrastructure because we're a platform. That's the gross generalization. We need to talk a little bit more about these components, and I'm going to live here for a while. Okay, start off with the first one. First thing I want to say is Azure is made up of a whole bunch of stuff. Does anybody remember when .NET came out? Was anybody in the, raise your hand if you were around when the word .NET came out. Did you know what it meant? I had no clue what it meant. What do people say today? What's .NET? What will they say? It's a programming language. No, it's not. It's some DLLs. No, it's not. It's actually a platform. It's a place where you can write code. And we were all confused, and no one knew what it meant. No, I'm not going to adopt that. I'm going to go back to my VB6 programming. What's wrong with Microsoft, right? And now we're all comfortable with .NET. We use it all the time. PowerShell's on .NET. SQL Server uses .NET. Everybody uses .NET. You don't even know it anymore. And that's what this is going to be. It's a bunch of stuff running around. Second thing you need to know. So number one thing you need to know is it's a bunch of stuff. Second thing you need to know, you can write that down in more technical terms if you want to go back and talk to your boss. Stuff freaks them out. Components is a good word. Write down components. It's a bunch of components. Componentized objects which produce data structures. Throw that in there. They'll be good. You're welcome. So this stuff, these pieces, can be used together, and this is the key for this presentation, or apart. You can use them separately. Okay? And we're going to do that today. We're going to take a look at some examples of using them separately. Wait a minute. So this is not an all or nothing play. No, it's not. That's the hybrid part. That's the distributed computing part. Distributed computing. Some things are done here. Some things are done somewhere else, wherever it makes sense. First part, compute. We have these things called roles, R-O-L-E-S, roles. These are VMs. There's VMs underneath, but you don't configure them. You just use them. One of the roles, called a web role, has an IIS 7 server living there waiting for you to tell it what to do. Whatever you can do in IIS, you can pretty much do there. That's as complicated as it gets. To a developer, they're like, great. In fact, if you're not a developer, but you're an infrastructure person, you're actually providing a web role to your developers now. So developers, just think of the fact that the infrastructure guys and ladies just give you a machine and you can use it. That's it. That's as complicated as it gets. There's another kind of role called a worker role. And I'm going to put all this together for you in an example in just a moment. I'm going to tell you a hybrid solution. So the worker role is just like the web role with one exception. It doesn't have any web stuff on it. Okay? It's basically a Windows machine with no web on it. But you can put web on it. In fact, you can put Tomcat. You could put PHP, Ruby, Perl. I don't care. It's a web role. I mean, a worker role. Okay? Everybody comfortable with those two roles? So let's take a hybrid example. Let's say I want to serve a website out for a little bit, maybe for a marketing campaign. Your boss comes to you and says, do we have capacity? Do we have bandwidth? How long is it going to live? 1 month. Are you going to buy a server for 1 month? Are you going to trash a server out for 1 month? Do you have servers running that you don't need? None of those things are acceptable to a good architect, right? So you say, hey, we can pin that to a cost. We know how much it costs per click to use Azure. There you go. You write a web role, you put an ASPX page or whatever kind of page you want in there. They click on it, they use it. When it dies, it dies. You quit paying for it. Bob's your uncle. Okay? Here's another interesting thing. Does everybody know where Bob's your uncle came from? Anybody not know where Bob your uncle came from? You don't? Okay, I'm going to tell you the story. So when I lived in England, I used to go to these things all the time, and they would explain where all of our words came from, right? All the things that we say. One of them was this guy apparently in Germany, and he was just the town lout. He would like beg money, and he was just a terrible guy. Well, it turns out he was related to Robert the something or other, some big royalty guy. And everybody had to start taking care of him or the uncle would come down because Bob was his uncle. All right. That has nothing to do with technology. So I'd throw that in there. All right. So the web and worker roles, basically you could do that website. You could have it pop up. You could have it pop down. Next thing that's interesting to know, so this is the third thing. It's a bunch of stuff. There are pieces you can use individually or together. Third thing you need to know is you can scale it with code. Meaning that I've got a website, it's running. Okay, so what? I can do that today. I could do that by a hoster. I could do it on my own website, easy peasy. But remember that problem we talked about with when your system gets busy, you tell your devs, make it not busy? If you're using stateless programming, we're not going to go into that today. If you're using stateless programming, you can have the code watch the system, and based on how much pressure it's facing, how long the delay is, how many users, all the above, it's code. You can do whatever you want. You can watch that and spin up a copy of itself automatically. And then we automatically round robin. So it'll start balancing out of that one. And when you need another one, you can spin it up. And here's what's even more important. You can turn them off when you're done. That's really important. Because it's easy to spin stuff up. It's like petting a puppy. You can bring a puppy home. It's hard to get rid of them once you have them, right? I mean, don't get me wrong. I love dogs. I mean, I can't eat a whole one, but I love dogs. So, all right. So the next component, everybody comfortable with compute? Any questions on compute? It's a server somewhere that you don't manage or build or anything else. It's just running and you get to use it. Questions? We'll come to security and all that stuff later. Storage. We have three kinds. A queue, a blob, and a table. A queue. A queue is exactly what it sounds like. If you're writing stateless code, so let's take it for example that I'm coming in to interview you. He and I are going to interview you. Okay? I walk in and I say, I'm Buck Woody. What's your name? You tell me. Where have you worked? And we start talking and I say, oh, I got a phone call. I'll be right back. I walk out. He walks in. He knows he's supposed to give the interview. We're duplicates of each other. He sits down. He goes, what's your name? And you tell him, where have you worked? And you tell him, and he leaves. And I come back in. And I say, so where have you worked? And you're like, oh my gosh, I don't want to work here. These people are schizophrenic. Because we don't have state. We're stateless. We haven't recorded anything anywhere. But assume now there's a piece of paper in front of us that has the questions on it. He and I both know the questions. When I come in and say, what's your name? I write it down. That's the queue part. I can pass a message. And if I go away, he comes back in, and he can read the queue. He can see it as well. Not only that, let's assume he and I are working together, and he's doing one thing and I'm doing another. Like while we're talking, I'm checking your criminal record, because I think I've looked at you before, and I think that's a good thing to do. So as I'm talking to you, I tell him, I put it in the queue, hey, you may want to check this guy's background. Is everybody with me? Oh, look at that. My software's going to expire. They put evaluation versions on all these systems. So what I'm going to do is just move it, because it's just going to say that again. Stop whining. All right. So and that was just visual interest to see what you're doing. So the storage queue is to pass messages back and forth and to remain stateless. Is everybody comfortable with that? That's a gross oversimplification. How many of you know how to do stateless programming? Was that good enough? Is that okay? Does that work, at least conceptually? All right. The blob is a binary large object. We can get up to a terabyte in these things, and you can have as many as you want. Videos, PDFs, Word documents. It's storage. It's just storage. How do I get to it? Is it an F drive? Is it No. You're in code, remember? So you just call an object, you're given back a handle, and you can talk to it. So you can store things in blobs. You can stream them out. We have a content delivery network that's closer to your users, blah, blah, blah. We have one company that's using only blob storage. You know what they do in there? They're training videos. Every company has to have compliance things for HIPAA and all that to train their employees. So what they do is they put their videos in there. From an on-premise link, they click a button to start the video, but they watch it from ours. Why do they do that? That way, if the nurse is overseas, she still gets to take her training in time. See, use it where it makes sense. Use only the pieces you need. They're only using blob storage. That's it. And that's completely okay. We're cool with that. It's just stuff you can use. Third is a table. Table is NoSQL. It's key value pair. For those developers in the room, raise your hand. Developers? Okay. So a C# or a Java hash table, if you're familiar with those, key value pair, that's what this is. You can get up to 1 terabyte in size in these guys, right? So the difference in our NoSQL and like a Cassandra or a BigDB is that this is immediately consistent. We do a 3-phase commit across. We keep 3 copies of your data all the time. We do a 3-phase commit, and we won't return back with a full commit until we're done. So we're immediately consistent, not eventually consistent. That's the difference. The Hadoop stuff you see is going to run across things like this. Comfortable? Okay. The one that's the hardest to explain is the application fabric because it's yet more pieces. It has within it a service bus, and that's full. How many of you understand what a Windows Service Definition Language WSDL endpoint is? Okay, good. A WSDL is merely a TCP/IP endpoint that will serve up some data when you ask it questions. You can actually do this in SQL Server today. So using the application fabric, you could actually take something you have on-premise right now and serve it up into an Azure app or even a different company's app. There's all kind of service. There's where you can advertise a service, like I will give you the next service or purchase order number. I will give you the next ticket, whatever, right? You can do all that with the application fabric. Think BizTalk. Next piece, authentication. We will allow you with the Azure Connection Services, which is part of App Fabric, to connect your Active Directory to a web app. We don't have an Active Directory, but we'll trust yours so that when you log in, we can say, is she part of this group, department? Is it this time of day? Then she's allowed access to this part of the app. You do that using something called, if you're taking notes, claims-based authentication. Most of you probably know what that is. If you don't, it's its own world, but it's the way you're going to secure things in a distributed environment. If you're not familiar with distributed computing, claims-based authentication is what you want. Yes, sir. Is claims-based authentication coming to SQL Azure anytime soon? No, because it's a totally different paradigm. We'll talk about where you would do that. Don't think, and this is the, let me rephrase, say this again. SQL Azure is not SQL Server somewhere else. SQL Azure has a use case that fits. It has use cases that do not fit. Okay. All right. Finally, SQL Azure. SQL Azure is a SQL Azure database level service. Everybody with me? Say database level. Okay. Very good. Not server level. Not instance level. Database level. Okay. That means if you need a database for a web app, or for an on-premise app, some other things that I'll show you in a moment. That's what it's for. Questions on these components can be used together, can be used separately, and by the way, they're all REST, R-E-S-T, representational state transfer type application aware. I'll get to your question in just a sec. REST, if you're not familiar with it, go read about it. HTTP is REST. If you ever typed in a URL and it's got the question mark and some stuff after it and so on, there's a header and all these other things that go across and you get your Hotmail back or whatever, that's all using representational state transfer data, REST. All of these have a REST endpoint, meaning this. You could drive an app purely through a web browser. You wouldn't have to write any code whatsoever. You could access a video if you just knew the right string to type in. And yes, you can secure it. Okay? So REST. Every one of these can be REST addressable. Now, what we do in the software development kit is we put nice APIs and pretty GUIs over the top of those so you don't have to do that, but you can. Yes, sir?
You mentioned claims-based security. Is there a ADFS component as part of Azure?
Yes. Yeah, so the question was, you mentioned claims-based authentication, not security, two different things. Claims-based authentication says the person with this claims token has access to these objects in this way. It's the most finely grained permission set you could ever come up with. It does not require that I know who you are. Think car keys. If I give you my car keys, which would be a horrible mistake, because you're from Canada and you probably just pile the car right into the tree because you guys drive on the other side of the road or something, right? So if I gave him my keys, the keys don't care that it's not me. Everybody with me? That's basically claims-based. He has the keys, that's the claim. So he can use it. So what I do then is I trust him to have my keys, and that's what I give them to him, right? So that's that the ACS portion that I'm describing is that trust piece. Here's what's cool. It's not just Active Directory. We can let you talk to Google, so they can log in with Google and use our app. They never send their name and password to us, ever. They send it to Google. Yahoo? Does anybody use Yahoo? Anyway. So you can use Yahoo. You can use Live ID. And you can use the world's biggest network, Facebook. And you can have an app that has spatial data in it because the phones know where they are. Holy cats. The systems, the phones know where they are now. We have the spatial data type inside SQL Azure. You could track that and tell them where the closest store is, doctor, street, a Starbucks in my case, and so on. Matter of fact, Starbucks has an app like that, right? All using just pure Azure stuff, nothing on-premise. It's all code. Everybody with me? All right. Questions on these pieces? If I have the question right, you're asking about the versioning of SQL Azure. Do I have that correct? So, I've got a database and it's written to 2005, 2000, 2008. Azure is Azure. So it's the latest version all the time. We patch it at least 3 times a year, sometimes a lot more. We try to make really small changes. The features are reduced so that we don't break things. That's the point. But there is testing. There's a website where you can go and see the release announcement so you can test and roll your app forward. But it's always the latest version. Somebody else had a question. No? Okay. All right. Yeah.
How's performance? What are the criteria for options for you get performance?
So the question is, how do we deal with performance inside this? It's its own world, and I'm happy to talk to you offline. I also have some resources, but I want to get through this before we talk about that. This is more where do I use it versus how do I tune it. There is tuning. There is tuning to do. Right? And there's things you can do to make it better and worse, if you like. Why would you do this? I'm going to rip through this really quick. We've kind of talked about this already. One is, if you have something that expands and contracts, you should be thinking about PaaS. Doesn't have to be mine, but think about PaaS, because you're the architects, you're the senior devs, senior DBAs. Secondly, if it's consumption-based, if you can tie it to an actual person logging in, and that makes money for you, think about PaaS. Partner, customer, department integration. What I mean by that is the customer wants to enter something that they're going to see that's their data, but on-premise needs to see it as well. You've got to either let them into your system or do some sort of bizarre ETL thing. Okay, this takes care of that. You just put it in the same place. Using the claims-based authentication, you give her rights as a client, because she logged in with Facebook, but me different rights because I logged in and I'm from this department. Make sense? And in fact, you don't even do that. You have the apps do it on their behalf. So the app will actually get the token, go get what it needs, and display it in whatever method, phone, tablet, whatever. With me? HADR, I have a group of people using that. If you need to extend your network, your current infrastructure, and you don't want to pay for a new building, or you just need something for a little while, or you just need some more storage, this is another way to do it. And then finally, if you need to write code and it needs to be up in 15 minutes, you can do that on Azure. You may not be able to do that on-premise. All right. This is gold for the architects. You want to download the slides. Let me explain what you're looking at. If you need to control a box, if you need to control one of these boxes, it should be black. Is everybody with me? You understand how this is being read? If you have to own by regulation or whatever the copper of the wire that's in the network infrastructure, you're on premise. You can't consider anything else. If that's okay, and if you don't even need to own the servers or the storage, but you need to own the OS, you want to patch it, you want to pay for it, you want to keep it up to date, then you can be an IaaS. But you'll need to figure out scale and runtime. Runtime meaning Java application version number, .NET flavor, whatever you want, okay? If you want all those things done, you want them there. I'm not saying you don't care about them. I'm saying you don't want to do them anymore, then you can consider Azure or another PaaS, We're sort of the big PaaS on the block right now, and Amazon's sort of the big IaaS, and then Salesforce is sort of the big SaaS. That's kind of the way it's breaking out. That'll change. We'll all leapfrog each other and so on. You have a more control and responsibility and less. Everybody understand how to read this? Just pull it down off the slide deck. Anybody need this still up here? All right, let's talk about Windows and SQL Azure. You can access things through REST. And by the way, so who asked me about REST access to SQL? Who asked me that a second ago? Azure, was it you? You were asking about? CBA you were wondering about. Okay, all right. So you can access SQL Azure through REST, but you do it through a wrapper and you use an OData provider. I actually do that all the time. I love OData because I can use it with anything. Next, you can use programmatic calls from the API. So you've got a software development kit, you can put it on and run it. And then SQL Azure is, of course, just TDS, just tabular data stream. The difference is it must be encrypted, and I only accept SQL auth. Okay? I can't bring your AD into my data center because I don't have an AD. I just trust yours, so there'd be no way for me to do that. Questions on the access methods. Now let's get to the fun part. This is one example of how easy this is to do. So let's assume now we need to talk to a database on-premise, and we need to talk to one in the cloud. Everybody with me? All right. We can use, this is just a C# code. It's very small, not intended to be read, so don't look for the words. It's just a block to illustrate this is possible. This is as long as the entire program is. Everybody with me? That's as long as it is. There's a couple of lines in there that make connections. One of those, and I have this code for you, by the way, on a blog post. If you want the actual code, it will run. And it would run, by the way, whether it was SQL Azure or SQL Server or Oracle or anything else. I make 2 connection strings. You could make more. I make 2 connection strings, one to Azure, one not. Everybody with me so far? All right. The next thing I do in the next line is I go get the data. And I'm just using C# to do this, and I'm just filling data sets. These data sets happen to be header and line item POs. Kim, sound familiar? Yes, I did this back at Jabil. So the header and the line item detail have a PO number in common. Everybody comfortable with this? You've got a header PO and you've got line items on it. Okay. And so this is a false key. There is no relationship between them because they're on different systems. This could be text files or Oracle. It doesn't matter. Okay? I go get both the data sets, and what I'm doing is I'm using, is anybody familiar with the data relation call? Data relation call inside C#. A data relation will take 2 dissimilar data sets and put them together based on how you tell it. It's a pretty cool thing to play with. So now I've got one data set made up of 2 places. Now I run a query quotient. I happen to use link. Don't hate me because I'm beautiful. All right? If you want to use something else, that's fine. But I used link to join up the data and run across the data and show all the things. Everybody with me? That's how simple it is. This much code, and I'm a hybrid solution. And there's no Azure code base or anything available. This is just pure SQL Azure. Well, I'm grabbing the wrong mouse. That would help. All right. Let's talk about our use cases here. I'm going to go to full screen on this guy so we can see it a little better. All right. So the first architecture I wanted to talk to you about was a WSDL endpoint. So this is just a Windows Service Definition Language. Let me explain what you're looking at. The first thing you're looking at, the first green icon, is the web role, as we discussed very early on. User hits a web role. There's some work the user wants to do, and so a worker role runs off behind the scenes, and while you're addressing the user, the presentation layer, that's where it lives now, because some people ask me, wait a minute, what about transferring all this data all over creation? Don't transfer it. This is called code close. Code close. Code far is what we use now. I have an app on my laptop. I hit a server somewhere else. It sends a fat load of data back, and I process it. Don't do that. Your new laptop, your new computer is the web, is a web role. Everybody with me? Okay, good. So I processed some data from the user. A worker role in the meantime is back there, I don't know, uncrunching a picture in my catalog, or maybe crunching the picture from the user to be stored in a catalog. I don't know. There's some table storage where I'm tracking what the user's doing. That's how I'm maintaining state. Across all of this, I've laid the application fabric WSDL endpoint. And I say, here's what Azure can give you back. There's a contract there, and it's secured. On the user side, maybe I've got a couple of buildings that are not even connected via a WAN. They're just LAN connected in the building. I expose a WSDL endpoint on both of those such that maybe in an Oracle system I can say, what's the next PO number? And in a SQL Server system I can say, who's the authorized sales accountant? And that all munges back and talks with each other, and the only stuff you have on premise is the stuff you have today, and you've added a WSDL endpoint. Questions on this architecture? All these I've put in somewhere. So if you want to know a little bit more about where I put it in, I can't tell you company names, but I can tell you how I did it. Okay? We're comfortable with this one? Anybody think of a use case where this makes sense? This is your quickest on-ramp to the cloud, is just to throw a WSDL endpoint over the top of something you've got internal. Then you've got to think about your firewalls and so on, right? But you don't have to think about VPNs. It's just an endpoint. Very cool. All right. Next use case is something we call client code. I put all the fat stuff in the client code, and then I call out to the services I need either on-premise or in Azure. Is everybody comfortable with that? Okay. This one's really easy to do. It's not always the most performant. Who was actually asking about performance? You were asking about performance. I wouldn't recommend this model for performance, but it's quick and easy to do. So what I did with this is I had a company that had access databases all over, and they want. I know, dude, it happens. I had one guy that had 5,000 internal, 5,000 access databases, and of course they're mission critical, as you know, right? It's just the way it works. So the point is, with the mission critical stuff, what I did was I just left his access front ends alone, and I just pointed it to SQL Azure. I've got an article that'll lead you through that step by step. How many of you have MSDN, an MSDN account? Okay, you have free Azure time already. I don't know if you played with it, but not only can you use the local emulator and never incur a charge, go read up on what you get as far as your MSDN account. You have rights and privileges to have live active databases out on Azure right now, or you can write Windows Azure programs. Understand how they're built, because you can go over your free rate. If you need more information on that, give me a call. All right. Everybody comfortable with this pattern? The next pattern is web code. This is a little smarter, and we actually have people that do this. They've actually got Amazon Web Services running, but they don't like all their eggs in one basket, and so they actually put some of the calls, both internal, out to Azure, and to the Amazon Web Services. That's all cool. Now, someone pointed out that might be tripling your error footprint, and it could be if all of those are independent and not interdependent, right? So you got to keep them independent of each other. You got to make sure that you don't have something that if it's down, it's the single point of failure, because now you have 3 of them. Questions on this pattern? Very simple to implement. Yeah, no, I'm good. We'll just go with it. This kind gentleman let me borrow his laptop. These people are all pros. They're good. As long as I'm not projectile vomiting, I call it a good presentation. You know what I'm saying? Or I actually call it a good presentation if, like, some of the audience is, right, depending on the topic. All right. All right. This one's interesting. Anybody use SharePoint? Nobody uses that, right? So we can move off from this. All right. Oh, Lord help us. Microsoft Kudzu. SharePoint. So a couple of us have SharePoint in our organizations, and we're asked to do things to where the SharePoint needs to reach out to the web. How many of you have this that you've been asked to do? You have to tell me if you've done it or not. And it's not trivial. You got to either put the SharePoint on the web or put another SharePoint on the web or do something weird. We actually have now where you can call Azure components within a SharePoint part, web part. So now that you can use the customer input can be used, and you can see it, the application, but it looks like SharePoint to your executives who, God bless, that's all they can use, that and email. And they're not even really good at email. We also have this thing called an appliance. So this is actually from a company called Store Simple, S-T-O-R Simple. I mentioned this yesterday. They have an appliance that will sit. Is anybody familiar with SharePoint enough to know what the words RBS means? Do you know what RBS is? Okay. A remote block server in SharePoint is something where you can actually have the full text indexed part, the blob storage that it has, which is terribly hard to do inside a database. It's a sort of a layer like the VSS layer inside SQL Server. That's this visual, or rather the shadow copy thing, and it sort of acts like a hard drive, if you will, but it's actually a provider that does that. Store Simple can act like one of those, meaning that you've got a box that you set, you point SharePoint at it, it'll really put the documents in that. Then the Store Simple appliance will put that on a cloud provider like us. Why would you do that? Well, now you can have customers hit that data, but they're not inside your organization. You've not opened up firewalls. They also have encryption, deduplication, and they've also got compression. So it's kind of nice. Look into that. It's not a Microsoft company. These are some good friends of mine. I like their product a lot. Questions on SharePoint integration. We're putting more and more stuff in here for Azure. SharePoint, yes, sir.
Is that like that example you gave earlier about the nurse watching a video from?
Exactly. So what you could have is the training department. So his question was, is that like the video I mentioned earlier that the nurses watched remote? And the training department could be using SharePoint. They weren't, but you could have the SharePoint. They could be loading up the videos into what they think is SharePoint, but in fact it's being faced out with a block storage. Does that make sense? Do you see where this starts to fit? Do you see why it's not hybrid? It's just a way of computing. And it is hybrid, right? So when somebody says cloud to you, I want you just to throw that out. Just get rid of that. Think of distributed computing, because that's what this is. Use the pieces in these use cases like I'm showing. Questions here? Great questions so far, by the way. I appreciate that. Okay. BizTalk. Any of you using BizTalk? Okay. So for those of you using BizTalk, we have full connectors now into the Azure Application Fabric Service Bus. So you've just opened up BizTalk to all your web apps if you want. You can also just make it a WSDL endpoint, but we fully support the BizTalk messaging system. So you can just send messages up to Azure. It could do something, send the user an email that says your order is being processed. Here's the information from the U.S. Post Service. They don't have to click a link. You could go scrub that because that's an OData feed, and so on. Very cool stuff. Very cool stuff. Questions on the BizTalk integration, since there's just one person using that. BizTalk's an amazing tool, but it's pretty esoteric. Questions? Okay. All right, good. All right. How are we integrating the tool set? We've got a few things. I'm going to let you read through some of those. Juno's been recode named. As you know, when I wrote this, the code names had changed and all that. So we are making, you can use Management Studio to hit SQL Azure. Visual Studio can hit Windows Azure and on-premise. In other words, you don't change anything you have now. You can just add in more stuff. We've got a web portal that's out there. SQL CMD works just fine. PowerShell works just fine. The new DAC, the changes they made in the DAC feature. Are you familiar with the DAC feature in 2008 that we introduced and all that? All right. So they've changed that now to where you could take an Azure database, hit a button, and it would basically make a package out of it, which you could then bring back on-premise data and all. Yes, sir. Yes. Yeah. Yep. That was they're working on that. Not sure if that's out of CTP yet, but yes, that's a use case. So his question was, am I going to be able to upgrade? I've birthed the database on-premise, and I want to upgrade an Azure database based on that. Yes. Answer is yes. Correct. Yeah. And the Redgate stuff still works. The Quest stuff still works. Well, question on the tools. So we're trying to leave the tools you have. However, you could do everything on the web with no tools. I've actually been at a hotel and I needed access to a kiosk. I was able to change an Azure application without touching anything on a box because I didn't have one. I didn't have this young gentleman roaming around, let me borrow his laptop. All right. This is the portion. We got about like 5 minutes left. I want to make sure I allow times for questions. So let me do it this way. Rather than just say, do you have any questions? Let's throw out a couple of architectures, and you guys tell me some ways that you solve this today and ways that you might think about solving it later. This might be the most important part of the day. I don't think we have mics or anything roaming around, so I'll just repeat what you say. So I'm going to throw out an application. You tell me how you'd solve it now. Let's start off with that. And it's okay. You don't have to give away company secrets or anything like that. Just give me general stuff. Did you have a question as well?
I would throw in architecture.
Oh, you want to throw out an architecture? Talk to me.
You tell me
How I would solve it. Oh, he's flipping it around. I like this guy.
big market data application.
Big market data application. Tell me what you mean by that.
I mean, so Thomson Reuters, I would put Thomson Reuters, a lot of market data, underplay analytics.
Okay.
It's all under right now. How we would fit in.
Yeah, excellent. So if I have the question right, you're asking about big data analytics. Oh, that's so awesome. So we could go on for days with this one, but here's my pet peeve around data analytics. And you'll recognize this again, Kim, because this is something we did at Jabil. I have something I call a clicks paradigm, C-L-I-C-K-S, clicks paradigm. I made that up. It's just me, so you're not going to find it. I actually wrote some articles on it, so you may find it, but it'll be me. So here's what I feel. There's certain kinds of data that finds you. When you get a text message, you didn't do anything. Your phone popped up and said, you've got this. When you get a reminder, that's a zero-click paradigm. There's data that finds you. Within your company, you have data that should be zero-click. You should tell a trader, commit the order. Your put order is here, right? There's one-click information. One-click information is something where I go click on a report. A web page is one-click information. Okay? So there's data that needs to be that way. You've got some salespeople who want to look at a dashboard. That's one-click information. Dashboard is one click. All right? Interestingly, should they have to one-click? Should that report be zero-click by finding their inbox? Good question. That's your job. You don't want to pollute their inbox, but you want to give them the ability not to have to one-click. Is one-click ever even necessary? Interesting. So then there's two-click. That's a report, but I can change it. I can flip the headers, I can slice and dice a little bit, but only through drop-downs and so on. Then there's three-click information. Three-click information is a palette, and I have to know how to use the tool, and I drag data sets on. This is like Power Pivot or something like that, right? So that's three-click. And then four-click information, that's you. That's what you designed the tools that everybody, or the data sets, that everybody else uses. With me? So within those 4 clicks, what I would push back with you on the analytics is which kind. So if it's zero-click information, you're going to scrub a ton of data, a buttload of data. That's a technical term. It means a lot. You're going to scrub a buttload of data that then gets an answer back, yes or no. Most of the time, how many of you have ever had a salesperson, you got a 60,000 row query, and they say, can you put that in Excel? You ever had that? You ever had that? What on earth can anyone find in 60,000 rows of data? They're looking for something. When anybody tells me, I say, what are you looking for? Can I have the keys to your house? What are you looking for? I'll go get you a coat if that's what you're looking for. No, you can't have the keys to my house. I'm not giving you 60,000 rows of data in Excel. What are you looking for? Your job is to figure out, do I turn that into an answer? The answer for that inside Azure, I'd probably have the data, either blob or table, depending on what the data is. I'd use the new Hadoop or MapReduce features, or Dryad, or Link to SQL, or any of that stuff we've got to handle big data sets to come up with a ding, the answer is 42. Everybody with me? All right. So then, if it's one click, though, they need to see a report. I probably use reporting services, which we have in Azure. You don't have to install reporting services. I have a company that they suck data out of data sets locally from multiple companies. I won't tell you what kind of companies. They pull data, everybody pools their data, and then they can see these aggregate reports. Their entire product is a 3-person company that makes a lot of money. Their entire product is a SQL Azure database and a reporting services report. That's what they sell for a living as a service. So maybe that's the tool I'd use for that, depending on what kind of data I need to scrub. If it's a 3-click report, or a 2-click report rather, now we're talking probably some sort of web code, some analytics, or maybe even storage that just does a data pump back and forth, depending on what the immediacy needs are. If it's 3-click, they need a tool they can use. We're going to shift to a fat front end, something like Power Pivot, that can now talk to Azure data sets and do analytics in the cloud. You're going to write those analytics, either using Hadoop or something like it. Does that answer the question? So the answer is, say it with me, Karen. It depends. It's just like Grandpa. It depends. Okay. Other questions? It's a great scenario. You guys have a scenario you'd like to, let's talk it through up here? Yes, sir.
So one of my clients currently does their Salesforce application, and they've got 800 to 1,000 people in the field doing sales.
Yes, sir.
They currently use Compact Edition and Replication.
Okay.
So it's disconnected most of the time. They connect, upload their changes. They've got massive concurrency issues with the system.
Oh, interesting.
So I would like to know if there's a way maybe to get that database up into the distributed computing model.
Yeah.
Get them away from the replication
Okay.
scenario. If they're willing to change the application to do all of that, go for it.
Yep. Okay. So I heard a bunch of questions there. Let me see if I tease them back out properly for the recording. So, and we're getting close to time. If anyone has to go to another session or wherever, feel free. You're not going to hurt my feelings, but I'm going to address this, and we'll talk it through. We'll take this one as the last one for today. You can catch me off stage for the rest. So the idea here is, you asked about, I've got a cloud-based service that they're using, but sometimes they're disconnected, so they pull things down. Or are you saying, there's a cloud-based service and they always pull it down?
Right now, they don't have any cloud involved.
They don't have any cloud involved at all. It's all on-premise, but they are disconnected from on-premise when they travel. Is that the problem? And they need to have it true. So you're using some kind of SQL replication or something to keep these large data sets in sync. The problem is then you're running into clashes because of I'm doing changes and he's doing changes, and we're having I don't know who wins problems. Or are you saying we both come back at the same time and my system is being buried because there's latency? Which one of those two things? You got a little bit of both. Okay. So the question now becomes, how could we fix this to where we don't get these things? The obvious answer, we're all architects here, is don't replicate. Okay, what does that mean? You could put it in a distributed computing environment like Azure. And there's lots of ways to solve it, just like we just discussed with his issue. Depends on what kind of data integration you need. The question I would push back on, though, is there a time when they're not connected that they would need to be working on this data? There are. Is that like a significant portion of time, or is it partial?
Probably when they're in front of customers, it's a small amount of time, but they have to.
And it's read-only type data, or is data that they're making changes with at the customer site? And the site doesn't have access to the internet at the customer? They might be in the field next to a house or something like that. Could be a home, something like that. So the point is you can't guarantee connectivity. So you're going to have an off-premise component. You just don't have a choice, right? Now we have to figure out how do we store that. Compact edition is fine. There's no problem there. But we do need to talk about how do we get the data back up and replicated. And the question then becomes, if we're going to replicate the data immediately, in other words, the minute the salesperson's connected, we don't want them to have to wait to come all the way back to the office is the problem. That you could do with data sync services, which is not a cloud function, but it will talk to the cloud. It will talk to Azure. We've got in CTP Azure Data Connect, and what that will do for you, it's kind of a pretty face over the top of data sync services. But the Azure Data Sync, which is in CTP right now, is made for exactly that. And although I'll be killed for saying this, so you'll see me in a bloody heap on the road in Seattle, think lazy replication. It's not really. But you get some things around guaranteed order and so on. And you would build in some mechanisms within Azure that would say, I've got a clash, and you'd make a GUI on how you handle it. Right now, you're having to do that. You would push that back to whoever the real decision maker is. And so what I would extrapolate back out to is, as an architect, the way I would look at this is, who's the final arbiter of the decision? Is it the user or you? If it's you, code it. If it's the user, put it up on their screen and say, I've got two conflicting orders here. Jane ordered 5 pairs of the red shoes. Buck ordered 5 pairs of the red shoes. We only have 5 pair. What do you want to do? Partial order, reject order, and so on. Push that back out to the decision maker. And with the claims-based authentication we talked about a few moments ago, I could even sniff out if Karen was in the right group. And if she's in the manager's group, I only show that screen to her. You see my point? You have a lot more flexibility, but here's the deal. 2 things I want you to walk away with. Number 1, a lot more is on the design. A lot more thoughts on the design. Right now we have SQL Server, Oracle, whatever, and so we just literally do whatever we need to do. Okay? We just stuff everything in there. But now what we're going to have is, where does this particular piece of data go? Does it go in Azure? Goes in Table? Goes in SQL Azure? Does it go on-premise? Where does it go? You're not just going to stuff everything into a database anymore. It's not the way life is. Secondly, okay, how many developers again? Raise your hand. How many DBAs in the room? Dudes, you're outnumbered. I hate to tell you this, DBAs, but you're going to start pushing more back into programmatic elements. Referential integrity, performance, design is going to come back out of the DAO, or excuse me, into the DAO, into the data access layer, not into the database. You can still enforce your business rules. I'm cool with that. We still have stored procs and all that stuff. It's all cool. Data types, all that. ACID, all good stuff. Relational design, normalization, still there. I'm not taking that from you. But the stuff you were like putting inside SQL Server, like Word documents and stuff, you're going to have to give it back to those guys and say, where's the best place for this? Guys, you've been fantastic. If you have other questions, nail me outside. I appreciate your time and your patience. Thank you very much.